So, good evening, everyone. I see we have a whole bunch of folks, some of whom I know, many of whom I don't know, from a variety of places. And I'm so delighted to welcome you to this webinar and book launch for Jesse Zink's new book, Faithful, Creative, Hopeful: 15 Theses for Christians in a Crisis-Shaped World. And we're going to talk more about the book over the course of the evening. But one of the things I will say is that the book takes the place where we are really seriously. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we find ourselves. And I'm here in Montreal, in the land that's historically known as Jojage. And Jero, our tech host, who's taking good care of us and stewarding us through this evening, is here as well, as is Jesse, and as I think are some of you. And I'm grateful for the Ganageha stewardship of the land and waters in this area before the arrival of European and other settlers. And also grateful that this is a land that has been a place of meeting between many nations for many, many generations. And hope our conversation tonight can honor that history as a place of exchange and meeting. And I'd invite you to take a moment, too, to recognize and give thanks for the original inhabitants of the lands on which you find yourself, and commit yourself to the work of justice and peace. I'll say that one of the things I really love about this book, and I think the exciting thing about this book, is that it's conceived to start conversations. Jesse has a series of theses, 15 theses, sort of in the spirit of Martin Luther, that open up space for us to talk about what the crises of our age are, about what the church is, and about what all of this means for Christian faith, practice, and life. So tonight we're going to have some of those conversations. We'll hear from the two other panelists who've also thought deeply about Christian faith in our current age. First, the Most Reverend Anne Germond, and then the Reverend Michael Blair. Bring the two panelists into conversation with each other, with Jesse, and later on with all of you. And there'll be a chance to ask questions. You can put your questions in the chat. The evening will be mostly in English, but if you want to ask your question in French, I'm happy to translate those so that we can have some of that conversation across languages as well. Before we start with Anne's reflections, a couple more words about the book. I said already that it's structured around these 15 theses. I wonder if Jesse thinks we all have a shorter attention span than our Reformation era ancestors. And they really point to the forces and powers in the world that challenge Christian identity and witness. Jesse talks about these forces really as polycrisis, a series of crises that define our age, and focuses on the crisis of climate change and a warming world, of economic structures that dominate perhaps all, or at least very many, areas of our lives, and of human migration that's spurred on by ecological and economic crises, but also itself causes often great human suffering. And part of the work of the book is to unmask these powers, to name them, to show how they work, and in so doing, start to imagine alternatives. And that's what the biblical authors mean when they talk about apocalyptic or apocalyptic consciousness. It's making seen the things that are otherwise obscured and hidden. So that's a piece of what we're doing tonight. And the second contribution the book makes is that it imagines ways that Christians can live in this world shaped by these crises. And here, I think the adjectives in the title, faithful, creative, and hopeful, run through the ways the theses provide and propose authentic Christian responses. They're faithful because they're deeply rooted in the breadth of the Christian tradition, in the scriptures, and in relationship with the work God does in Jesus. They speak to other people, but they name a particularly Christian response. And then they're creative. There's nothing here about preserving the shape of the inherited North American church just for the sake of it, but about naming responses that make sense for the world in which we live, how we can be faithful in the times and places in which we find ourselves. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, they're hopeful. And maybe that's what our world needs most of all right now, a way to live as though the promises of our faith matter in this age, to live as though our lives matter, even when crises might want to drive us to despair or inaction. And there's space there, I think, whether you agree or disagree with one of them, with some of them, with all of them, but that our reflection together hopefully can open up space for faithful, creative, and hopeful responses. So let's turn to that conversation. First, with comments from the Most Reverend Anne Germond, and then from the Reverend Michael Blair. So the Most Reverend Anne Germond was born in South Africa and raised in the Roman Catholic Church. Moving to Canada in 1986, she found a home in the Anglican Church of Canada. In 2000, she was ordained priest and began serving as incumbent of the Church of the Ascension in Sudbury, Ontario. In 2017, she was elected Bishop of Algoma, and the next year elected Archbishop of the Ecclesiastical Province of Canada. In September of this year, she became the acting primate of the Anglican Church of Canada, following the retirement of Linda Nichols. So Anne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and good evening, everybody. It's really great to be on this webinar this evening. And Jessie, thank you for the invitation to read your book and to be part of this conversation. What I'd like to do to begin is to speak a little bit about how I engaged with the book. I began to read it, and then I thought, this is not a book that I just want to read at any time. So I began my day, as I begin every day, with the morning office. And I usually use that early morning time for some form of reflection, reading. And so every day for 15 days after morning prayer, I read a different chapter of the book. And then I used the rest of the day to sort of reflect on what I had heard in each chapter of the book. And I found it to be really formative and transformative in my own personal spiritual formation. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Diocese of Moosonee began having weekly gospel-based discipleship gatherings. And we would take a passage of scripture, and in reading it, we would consider 3 questions. What image, idea, or phrase stands out to you as you hear this reading for the first time? And the second time, what is Jesus saying to you in this reading? And then what is Jesus calling you to do? So that's how I embraced this book. Each day I would say to myself, what are some of the images that are standing out to me in each chapter? What might Jesus be saying to me, and what might Jesus be calling me to do? And so very, very conscious, as Jen and the book names, of the many crises that are going on in the world right now. And this week is COP29. We've just gone through an American election. And I must say, I cannot help but name that Taylor Swift has literally taken over Toronto by storm for 2 full weekends. And each concert will be bringing in over $13 million. And so in the very first chapter of the book, Jessie writes that in a market economy society, the only value that matters is price. And so very, very timely as we consider those holy days that you mention in your book, Jessie. Super Bowl Sunday, Black Friday, Christmas with kids, all those things on which we put a price and a value. And just how much I have been thinking this week, just how much people were really prepared to spend on a Taylor Swift concert. In 1977, when I first started attending an Anglican church in South Africa, I read a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger by Ron Snyder, I think, which really challenges how Christians are spending their money. And if everything is economic, if everything is around money, then I think we have lost something. But what I really appreciated about that very first thesis was you saying that we are enough, not by what we spend, by what we accumulate, by what we have, but by what has been done and given to us in Christ Jesus. And so this first thesis, but each thesis after that, pulled me back to the heart of who we are as Christians, of what God has done for us, and then what we are to do with all of that. So as I think about engaging this book personally, I thought about it through the lens of people who might be interested in buying it and might be interested in reading it in small groups. And I could see this as part of a Lenten study. I would love to see a study guide with it, with some really good questions for people to wrestle with. Our church is changing. The face of the church is changing. You named that in the book. The number of new immigrants who've come to Canada in this world where there are so many migrants, so many people. Many of them are finding their ways into our congregations, and it would be wonderful to sit with this book and to hear some of the responses through the lens of somebody who has come from a country other than our wealthy North American culture, but a country, a farming community, perhaps in parts of Africa, or someone who's come from a war-torn country. I wanted to speak a little bit about thesis, your fourth thesis, which is about attentiveness to a distracted people. And one of the many problems of life now is just how distracted and fractured our lives are by all the demands upon them, with not enough time for really deep engagement, but sort of a really surface level engagement. And as I was reading your book, what I came away from it was an invitation to wrestle with some of these really difficult issues, crises that you've named, but what hopeful responses might be in them. So you name the indifference to suffering. You name greed and our constant need for more and more and more, and contrasting that with the manna in the wilderness, which was only enough for one day, and the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And so what does enough mean in a world which is constantly inviting us to more, to spend more, to consume more? I heard you saying in your book, this is about gifts given to us by the grace of God and how we receive the gifts that God gives us, and how we then share the gifts which we have been given with others. I do think that the antidote that you suggest, if I can use that word, the antidote to distraction being attentiveness. And so how can we as a people of God, instead of always needing to be doing, how can we spend more time being? You use that beautiful description of the incarnation of God reaching down to humankind. And you use that image of us stretching out our hands extended to God in prayer and out to one and to humankind. And so how might we, as we approach the season of Advent, which we are entering now, which I think just ramps up this economy, the need to consume, the need to buy, how might we pay more attention to stretching forth our hands in a different way this Advent? And I'm cognizant of time and just how quickly 10 minutes goes. You speak about the Eucharist setting the agenda for how we are as Christians. And I loved the way you expressed it by saying that not every church can have communion every week, but that doesn't mean that in our services of worship there aren't other actions which call us to a posture of hopefulness. And you used the sharing of the peace and how we might embody being peacemakers. How we might use confession and absolution in the service, how we might use that act of remembering who and whose we are. But I wanted to suggest, Jesse, that you add one more action in your chapter. And that is, those are the words that are offered by the deacon right at the end of the service, where the deacon says, "Go in peace to love and serve the world." In order to be out in the world, we actually need to go. We need to leave those places of comfort. We need to leave our church buildings, which often have such a hold on us. And we need to get out there and to offer those words of peace and hope. As a people who trust in the steadfast love and faithfulness of God, and remembering that we are not islands unto ourselves, but that we are deeply connected with the folks around us in our congregations, in our communities, and in the world. It was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who coined the phrase Ubuntu, which says that a person is a person through other people. And what I heard in your book was just a great desire for us to connect more deeply with one another as Christians, and with people of other faiths and other denominations, so that we can together we can build trust in a world that certainly is longing for something new.
Thank you so much, Anne, for those reflections on sort of how you read the book and what you took from the book, and that way you connected the theses and the comments with sort of the deep well of Christian faith, and also for your challenges, for the things that are missing, for the things that we should add. So thank you so much. We'll turn to the Reverend Michael Blair. Since November 2020, Michael Blair has served as the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, functioning as the Chief Executive of the Church's General Council Office and overseeing its ministry and witness across Canada. In that role, he's led a strategic planning process that calls the Church to focus on bold discipleship, daring justice, and deep spirituality. Originally from Jamaica, Michael initially served in ministry in the Baptist tradition before being admitted to the United Church in 2010. Before becoming General Secretary, he served in a range of ministries in Southern Ontario. He is currently also serves as the moderator of the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism of the World Council of Churches. And in that role, he convenes Christians from around the world to discuss, reflect, and encourage the church in its witness to the world. So thank you, Michael, for agreeing to speak, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts too.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Jesse, for the opportunity to engage with your book. I'm grateful for the things you have offered, and I'll offer some reflections based on some work that we've been engaged in the world mission space, as well as in the space of the United Church of Canada. I like and hope that as the book rolls out, that you would provide some opportunities for a study guide or ways to facilitate some discussion. I'm appreciative of the fact that the book has an incredible contextual framing, that you frame the thesis within the context of the current experience of the world, as well as within the context of the church and Christianity. I'm appreciative of the fact that one of the things the book does is to really emphasize that the vocation of being Christian is critical. And I'm appreciative of the fact that in many ways, you didn't attempt to solve the problems of the church, but is an invitation for those of us who claim to be part of the Christian family, followers of Jesus, to dig deeply to try and understand what our vocation is as Christians in the context of the world we live. And so your ability to draw from history, locate in the current experience, and to then offer some reflections and insight in terms of what does it mean for the Christian vocation. I came at this through a couple of lenses. I think the first lens that I kind of read and interacted with the book was from the lens of a denominational bureaucrat, um, being part of the United Church of Canada, who, although we are on paper the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, we are a denomination that experiencing some significant challenges in terms of decline. And your emphasis throughout the book on how the economic forces influence the ways in which we seek to live out our lives is quite profound. I remember in 2009 at one of our general council, the chair of our finance committee got up, he held his pencil up, and he said to the church, if you don't define your ministry and mission, the accountants will do it for you. And it feels very much like the accountants continue to make decisions in terms of how we engage in the world and in ministry. And so from that lens of trying to understand what the possibility of the hope for a future of church, it was quite helpful, and I was particularly intrigued by the thesis that said that Christian formation wasn't failing. It was losing the battle in many ways, because one of the ways in which we've been thinking about the issues in the church is this whole question of, have we failed in our ability and our capacity to pass on the story and the tradition to another generation? And we have wrestled with the question of Christian formation. And over again, I find myself saying that if only we had done the work of formation in a more robust ways, we probably would be in a different situation right now. And so it was a helpful reminder of how forces and economic forces are at play in terms of the whole question of Christian formation. I would love for you to tease that out a little bit more. And so part of my encouragement to you would be as others engage the book, that we would engage a little bit around this whole question of Christian formation, because I think part of the challenge or the opportunity is this whole larger question for me of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And I think in some ways you have painted a picture of that discipleship by inviting us to understand the vocation that is ours as Christian in the world, in the midst of crisis, and how we find hope. But it would be helpful to tease that out a little bit. The second lens that I came as I read your book was through the lens of some work that I was engaged in recently around the theme of mission as counter-creating. And this idea that as Christians and as followers, we are being called to counter-create, that the forces that are part of the kind of experience and expressions in the world that our partnership with what God is doing in the world requires us to be to counter-create. And in that way, I was caught and pleasantly surprised by this emphasis in the book on resistance. Partly because in many ways we value resilience, and the challenge is that resilience keeps everything in order, whereas resistance allows us to shift, to move, to say that what is isn't. And so I was a number of the thesis had this strong emphasis about how is it that as Christians we resist. And in some ways, you began to kind of shape what are the possibility of a counter narrative as Christians in the context of a world where so much crises are happening. And this undercurrent that keeps coming up in the text around the impact of the economic systems and structures that are influences how we are in the world. The third lens that I experienced the book or read the book in is through the lens of two particular themes. In 2013, the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism offered to the World Council of Churches a new framework for understanding the work of mission. And one of the significant part of that is the concept of missions from the margin. And the notion of missions from the margin was supported by the fact that the Spirit was playing a significant part in the work of mission in the world, and that we were invited to be attentive to what the Spirit is doing and about in the world. But it also emphasized the fact that folks who experience marginalization have an ability to teach us how to be faithful in obedience to what God is doing in the world, and that we needed to be attentive to the voices and the experience of those who are on the margins, those who have been marginalized, in terms of how they are learning resistance and how they're learning to be faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of the marginalization they experience. In your first thesis, you began to get at that in terms of, as you unpack the notion of apocalyptic clarity, and you begin to talk about the Revelation and what the kind of the group that was talking, and you began, I think, to tease out the importance of being attentive to those who are marginalized. And in some ways, I think I would also encourage you to kind of do some, I think there's some more to be done in terms of how it is that the agency of the marginalized also helps us to live the reality of the tensions in the theses that you have outlined. And so I think for me, I began to sort of catch a vision as I read around that theme of missions from the margin and attentive to the marginalized. And I was looking for more in that. The other piece of work with the World Council of Churches, the Commission on World Mission, is the Arusha Conference from 2018. And as the World Conference on Mission gathered in Arusha, one of the things that it came out with was this invitation to transforming discipleship. And they were very key in it's not about transformative discipleship, but it's about transforming discipleship. And an understanding that discipleship was an invitation both to a relationship and to a vocation. And it talked about that vocation was about partnering with what God is doing in the world. And in that way, the transforming discipleship is about it's missionary in character, in the sense that the vocation as disciples, we are engaging in the world in terms of what God's doing in the world, in terms of the transformation of the world. And I just want to say thank you, because I think the book is a model of what transforming discipleship is about. And that engagement of the context from the perspective of what it means to live out Christian vocation. And I just want to, that for me, I'm really excited about the notion of Christian vocation that just gets every one of the theses that you've laid out is an invitation for us to lean deeply into what our vocation is as Christians. And in that way, I think that it wasn't about the survival of the church, but it was about how the people of God were called to live in the world. And all the thesis kind of brought me back to that place of transforming discipleship that is about this vocation. The third and the final thing I would say is that the United Church of Canada, as we've done our strategic work, we have identified this call of deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. And that has become kind of a framework in which we are seeking to talk about who we are as the United Church of Canada and how we kind of live in the world, rooted in our spiritual tradition and history, the discipleship, the kind of vocational piece, and the bold discipleship, which is about how is it that we continue to resist the forces and the powers that would kind of demonize and rend relationships apart. And so in some way, in many ways too, I read your book through the lens of that framework of deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and dare injustice. And so I'm grateful to you for this gift because it becomes part of the resources that we will use in the life of the church to help our folks understand what it is, that it's not about ultimately the survival of the church, but it's about the people of God living into the reality of what it means to be the people of God, resisting the forces of empire, the forces that marginalize, and to end, I think I'm reminded of the words of Rabbi Joshua Herschel, which says, "Theology consists in worrying about what God worries about when God wakes up in the morning." And that the wholeness and well-being of the creation, the forces that marginalize economically, um, and the crisis of migration, those are things that worries the heart of God. And you've given us some insight in terms of how we live as the people of God in the midst of that. So gratitude.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for leaving us with that really deep concern about, worrying about what God worries about when God wakes up in the morning. That call to a Christian vocation as though that's transformed, Christian living that's transformed in the world, that's resistant, and that is coming from the margins. And I think for those who maybe are not coming from the margins as deeply transformed by listening to that. So thank you so much for those reflections. We'll turn to Jesse. Jesse, there's been all kinds of gratitude here for your book and for your writing. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and your reactions to Anne and to Michael. So many of you, I think, probably know Jesse, but the Reverend Canon Jesse Zink is principal of Diocesan Theological College, or DIO, since 2017. Born in Vancouver and raised in the United States, Jesse served in ministry in Alaska, South Africa, and England before arriving in Montreal. He's the author of several previous books, including Backpacking Through the Anglican Communion, A Search for Unity, and Christianity and Catastrophe in South Sudan, Civil War, Migration, and the Rise of Dinka Anglicanism. Over to you, Jesse.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Jen, for hosting this evening. And big thanks to Anne and Michael, to both of you for being here and to reading the book with such care and with such charity. And thank you to everybody who is here online. I just want to say, a few words. There's obviously a lot of words I could say, but I've written the book, so I'll try not to say all of them again. I think, though, I mean, I want to say something about where this book came from. So this is a book that came from a sense of dissatisfaction. When I write books, I try not to write books that say things that other people have already said. And the dissatisfaction was from a couple of places. One was just from being alive at this time and feeling that the world that we live in now is some distance away from where God longs for that world to be. That's of course not unique to our time, but feeling that particularly acutely. And thinking about this word crisis that I was hearing all the time, and then hearing this word polycrisis and asking myself, what does Christian witness look like in this time? And then a dissatisfaction also, though, with the discourse in the church about how we talk about our response. And Michael, I really appreciated you drawing attention to that thesis. I think I phrase it as Christian formation is not failing, it's being defeated. And I was getting tired, like literally tired, myself of working so hard and feeling like nothing was changing, and then blaming myself, and then deciding that the only way out of that was to work harder. And I was getting tired, and I knew that other people in the church were in the same position, and saying to myself, it's not just about me. For one thing, God is in the midst of this somehow, but we exist in a set of structures. We exist, to use a biblical phrase, within a world shaped by powers and principalities that are shaping our success. We are not the only people as Christians who are trying to form people, right? There are other forces that are forming and shaping people into different kinds of beings, and those forces are shaping them away from how God calls us to be. And I began to think about that. So much of my interactions in the world are economic, and so much of the powers of this world are shaping me to be a consumer and to be a good consumer. And I thought, I'm not me. All of us are made in the image of God. To what extent is God a consuming agent? Is God's image a consuming one? And I thought, I think the only place in Scripture that the word consuming comes close to God is with God in the burning bush and Moses in the book of Exodus. And it's very clear the bush was not consumed. And so it was a dissatisfaction with how I felt the world was trying to shape me and all of us, that I'm more than a consumer. I want to be more than that. I want to be a child of God. I want to claim that identity, claim that vocation, as to use the word that both of you used. But that, and I want other people to claim that vocation, because I think it's a much richer identity than simply being a consumer. And so that's how I began to think about powers and principalities. It's how I began to think about this apocalyptic clarity. Apocalyptic clarity, as I use it in this book, simply means being aware of those other powers that are out there in the world, especially the powers like of economic forces, to take one example. And that if we can change the narrative away from how hard can we work, because we'll never be able to work hard enough to defeat those powers. We will always end up feeling like failures, and that's going to lead us to being exhausted. It's going to lead us to feeling defeatist. It's going to lead us to feeling cynical sometimes as well, to giving up hope. And so to reframe that conversation and say, what kind of structures do we exist in, and how are they defeating us? And therefore, how can we resist those structures? So that was part of my dissatisfaction that prompted this book, and that's certainly where a lot of the call for hopefulness comes from. I tell people that the tone I'm going for in this book is bleakly hopeful. I don't always think it's a very positive or uplifting book, but that's, I think, a reflection of the world that we live in. But I do hope that it is deeply, deeply hopeful, and I write a lot about hope in this book. And I think that hope as a unique gift of Christians is so important at this time, especially as we look ahead towards Advent, this season of hope. I want to just say something as well about the structuring device of the thesis. I didn't settle on the thesis because I thought I was Martin Luther, but I settled on the thesis partly because I was dissatisfied with going to church meetings where it just seemed like one rhetorical question after another. Like, what would it be like if, or how do we respond to this situation in this way? And I just thought to myself, could we start answering those questions? I don't care if we give the wrong answer, but let's just answer them. And so I just wanted to make some declarative statements. And as I say, and as Jen highlighted at the beginning, this is a contribution to a discussion and an invitation for response. And so I'm so grateful to Michael and Anne for you encouraging me to think about ways to go further. I think the other thing about a thesis is it forced me to be short. A couple of these theses on their own could have been whole books, but I was quite determined that I wanted to write something that was accessible to people. I wanted to write something that was accessible to people in the pews. So I'm pleased to hear you think it could be used in that way. And I wanted to touch on a range of subjects. And so the thesis was a helpful structuring device to do that. Maybe I'll just say a few more things. I do think, I do think you know, we are at a moment where we need to wrestle. I think, Anne, you used that phrase, wrestle with the context in which we find ourselves, which can be so, which seems like it works so much against the kingdom, the commonwealth that Jesus enacts and proclaims. And I love that. I love that image of wrestling. I think, you know, one of my favorite phrases that comes out of the world mission movement is proclaim the gospel afresh in every generation. Well, if you go back through history, the gospel's always been proclaimed, but the form that it takes always looks a little bit different. It's the same gospel, it's the same Jesus, it's the same God, but what we choose to emphasize and how we choose to talk about it has shifted over time. And that's part of the wrestling that I want to do here, both as our church changes, but also as our world changes as well. So I do think that, as should be clear from the structure of the book, I begin with this idea of apocalyptic clarity. That this is a book that where I say very clearly, I want us to be apocalyptically oriented Christians, which isn't to say I want us to think about the end of the world all the time, but I want us to think about unveiling the powers and the structures and the principalities of this world that are working against the kingdom of God. But Michael, I really take the point about mission from the margins. I think that's really important, because what I want to highlight, and I hope I mentioned this enough in the book, you know, apocalyptic literature, which is part and parcel of the Christian scriptures, particularly in the book of Revelation, but elsewhere, apocalyptic literature is sometimes called the literature of the oppressed, right? It is certainly not written for white, male, well-educated, economically comfortable theological college principals who live in big urban centers in first world countries. In other words, it's not written for people like me. And in fact, in Canada, some of the most interesting apocalyptic writing recently has come from Indigenous people who say, well, you guys are waking up to apocalyptic Christianity, but you know, we've been dealing with a post-apocalyptic world since 1492 or thereabouts. And so this is yet one more opportunity in which settler-descended Christians, such as myself, have an opportunity to be in a real relationship of receiving, of theological dialogue and receiving with our Indigenous siblings in Christ. So I'll just say I'm late to the apocalyptic party, right? Perhaps, you know, we should have been listening to this a long, long time ago. But if by giving some attention to it, that can help reframe discussions, I think that's well, then that's just I'll take it as a contribution of this book. And then I think I mean, I do want to underscore just how much this book is really meant to be a contribution to a discussion and an invitation to a response. I will say I initially wrote about 19 theses. They didn't all quite, a couple of them weren't quite ready for prime time. And then the publisher said, well, you know, it's getting kind of long. And then at some point we had to decide on the title of the book, and then it was 15. And I was like, well, I guess I'm stuck with 15. So there are more things that could be said. But I just want to, I guess, underscore that in response to what both of you said, that of course, you know, the three of us all work in the church. We're all committed to the church. We're all committed to seeing this church that we love flourish and thrive. But that ultimately underlying that church is gospel, is good news, and that's what we don't want to lose sight of. And that I'm constantly asking myself, what is good and what is new that Christians have to share with the world, and that's what I was trying to put the focus on. And whether it's through thinking about ideas of enoughness in a world of more, or thinking about ideas of mercy, thinking about attentiveness in a distracted world, thinking about alternate identities as humans beyond being consumers, then I hope in that way it's some contribution to helping us discover what it is that is good and new about what we as Christians have to share in this crisis-shaped world. So maybe I'll just stop there and hand it back to you, Jen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse, for that sort of resume and for continuing to invite the conversation. So that's what we want to turn to now. We want you to continue the conversation. The way you can do that is you can put a question in the Q&A. You can type it out in English, en français. Vous êtes les bienvenus de poser vos questions, d'offrir vos réflexions. Questions, comments, more of a comment than a question, however you want to phrase that. You can put that, I believe you have an option to do that either with your name attached to it or anonymously. You can also put your comments in the chat, and Jero and I will see them and read them out and post some of them to Jesse, but also to Anne and to Michael. So please, your comments and your questions are really welcome and I think really valuable contributions. So the first question we have is, what are the 15 theses? Do you want to take that one, Jesse?
Well, it's a good question. We thought about putting them all up, but it didn't. Well, they're all complete sentences, sometimes more than one sentence, and so perhaps though what we could say is this. First of all, the book is organized. While it is true, I'm not aspiring to be Martin Luther. There's one negative lesson I took from Luther, which is that Luther wrote 95 theses, but didn't use any section headings. And so it's impossible to pick up his argument in the middle of the thing. And so I decided we needed some section headings here. So the book is organized into 4 sections. Apocalyptic clarity. And so that's 3 theses at the beginning about this idea of apocalyptic clarity. So one of those theses is the one Michael picked up on. Christian formation is not failing, it's being defeated. And then it moves into a section about this idea of resistance. The next section is resistant ethos. And one of those is what Anne picks up on. Christians offer attentiveness to a distracted people. And so the book is structured such that there's a thesis and then there's a chapter that explains that thesis. Another thesis in that section is, in an angry world, the Christian answer is mercy. And then the third section shifts from ethos to practice. So resistant practice is the third section. Here's one we didn't speak about, but one that's close to my heart. Food is at the center of the church and must be at the center of Christian witness. One that Jen picked up on right at the beginning, place matters. Christian witness begins in particular in specific locales. And then the final section is renewed church. Section of theses more focused specifically on the church. So that's one Anne picked up on. The Eucharist sets the agenda for the church. One that is near and dear to my heart. The church's future is an ecumenical one, but a very specific kind of ecumenism. That's probably the one where you'll see my background as a church historian most clearly, but don't worry, it's still interesting. And that's the book, and then there's a conclusion. So 15 theses organized in 4 sections. And I don't think we said, but if you look on Google Books, you should be able to find a free preview of the introduction and first 2 chapters, including the table of contents.
So another question we have here, and my bias is showing because I would ask the same question in some ways, is, Jesse, if you had a 16th thesis, or maybe Anne and Michael, after reading the book, if you thought there was a 16th thesis, what would it be? And our questioner says, maybe it would look like something of an interfaith future. Maybe it would address how Christians interact with people of other faiths. But maybe each of you have an idea of what's the 16th thesis or the next piece to move this forward.
I'd love to hear from Anne and Michael on this one.
I would love to see something about the voice of young people. I think our youth have got such incredible gifts. to offer the church and the world. And I would love a thesis that speaks to sort of hearing more from the voices of young people who we speak so much about, you know, the youth being, you know, there for the future of the church, but actually the youth are part of our church right now. And how do we hear their voices? Jesse, you could set, I don't know what the thesis would be, but over the last couple of weeks on 2 different occasions, I have been so incredibly impressed with the voice, the prophetic voice of the youth, of young people in our church who want to be heard, who want to make a difference, who want to be the church now. And it's a very different church, that, you know, it's not one that is necessarily within a building. It's a church that very much wants to get out into the world and to sort of have that missional forward-looking posture. So I would love something around the voices of young people.
I guess
Thanks.
for me, and it's part of that starting chapter on apocalyptic clarity, the piece around the marginalized, that folks who are on the margin. So given voice to the marginalized would be one of the theses, something I would kind of develop. I'm not sure kind of how I would frame it. And just to say, I think this notion of missions from the margins, not missions to or with the margin, but from the margin. So how does marginalized community help us in this kind of journey of resistance? So that would be something I would want to explore. I think I'd also want to kind of, I know the 8th thesis is about hope, and that, you know, we're built on that hope is one of the ways. But I wondered about kind of a more radical notion of hope, in the sense of you know, I think of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, I think it's verse 12. Because we have this hope, we act boldly, and a thesis around being bold in our engagement in the world, rooted in a sense of hope. And I know that earlier thesis in number 8 does speak to the issue of hope, but I think there's I think of the words of the Black national anthem when it talks about in the days when hope unborn had died, and something about the energy of that kind of boldness of hope. So.
Thanks, Michael. Great
Sorry, Jen,
places.
can
Do you want to say something, Jesse?
well, I was just going to say those are both great. I really like the word boldness there. I mean, bold discipleship. I know it's on brand. But I mean, I think the word I may use, although I've certainly used it more since finalizing the text of this book, is the word confidence. Which is you know, the other thing I should say about this book is it reveals my love of words and wordplay. I think, you know, I sometimes I felt like I'm just doing a little too much etymology here, but the word confidence means to live with faith, right? And that's really what I want to call us all, is to live with faith, to live confidently. And I think I tell the story about the summer camp director who I worked for a long time, who was taller than me. I was tall. I was sort of like a slouched over teenager. And he came to me and he said, "Jesse, you're exactly as tall as God made you to be. So roll your shoulders back and be who God called you to be." And I try not to slouch as much anymore. And that's what I want us as Christians to do as well, to roll our shoulders back and stand up straight. But I like boldness. I like boldness a lot. So thank you for that. You know, I don't know what my 16th thesis is. I know I have some other chapters saved on my computer somewhere, and maybe they'll see the light of day someday. But in response to that question, I'm gonna pass right now, I think.
So I'm gonna tag another question on to that I think sort of develops on some of what Anne was saying about you. And you said something about young, listening to the voices of young people and young people who don't necessarily look at the churches inside the building. But for all of you, one of the questions we have here is, to what extent can the passing away of church institutions or organizational structures be part of the bleak hopefulness that Jesse describes? And maybe we can start with Anne. Maybe Michael, I'm hoping you have some thoughts. You said you read this as with the lens of a church bureaucrat, and then we can turn to Jesse as well.
There's one part in the book where Jesse writes about letting go. What do we have to let go of? Letting just that kind of self-emptying, and I think that a church without borders is a church that can go to, in Michael's words, to the margins and not be afraid to stand there and to stay there. And a church that can hear those voices wherever they are, whatever difficult place is that margin is, not be afraid to go there and to be there. But what do we have to let go of? What do I have to let go of as a leader in the church to let that happen? There is resistance to letting go of space, of buildings, of structures. There's fear in that, because actually it's all we know. It's all I know. I mean, grew up, the church has been my life. I don't know anything else. So for me as a bishop now, to meet people who never experienced Christmas in the way that I did, who never heard the story of the birth of Jesus, who that is completely foreign to them. What is good and what is news? What is the story for the church to tell in this time outside of our church building? What do we need to let go of to do that? So I think of the Archbishop of York, who recently did a cross-Canada tour. And when he came to the ecclesiastical province of Ontario and spoke at our synod, he spoke about us being a simpler, humbler, older church. And those words really have resonated with me. What do those three things look like? And I would also say a kinder church, because I think there's a lot of harshness out there, and there's a lot of anger in some ways. And so how do we replace that anger with mercy and gentleness and kindness?
Thanks, Anne.
And I would say, I mentioned earlier, I think one of the gifts of the book is that in some ways it is rooted in the church, but it's not about the survival of the church. And it has an ecclesiology, it has an assumed ecclesiology, but it doesn't necessarily articulate that fully. But what it leans into, which is for me the exciting thing about it, is this, as I said earlier, is this kind of vocation. What does it mean to be a Christian, and what does a Christian, as Christians, what it is that we have to offer the world? And so that kind of identity as Christians. And so in some ways, I think we've gotten so caught up with the structures that we've forgotten to kind of live in the world. And I think in some ways that's why the chapter or the thesis around formation is something that it's tweaked my interest, and I wanted I want to have a conversation with Jesse more about that, because in some ways this invitation about how it is that we live in the world, as opposed to not necessarily how we structure ourselves and what we survive. And I think um, um, if we can help our communities begin to wrestle with that question about how we live in the world, we may find ways in which we can let go of the systems and the structures that we're more shaped, I think, by our identity of which camp we belong to than we're shaped by the fact that we're followers of Jesus. And I think the other thing I would say, and Jesse, as you talked about confidence and the story, one of the things I had written down as I was reading through the book was that there was this note of the fact that it is okay to be Christian in the world, and that we have both a calling, and we have the capacity to live and make a difference in the world. And there's this sense of I think we live in a world now, most of us is particularly in the mainline church, are ashamed of our Christian heritage. We whimper around it, and I think what the book did for me, at least, was just this reminder that one can live with confidence in the world, knowing the resources that are ours and what shape us, and we can actually survive in the midst of the crisis. Not just survive, but thrive in the midst of this crisis. And it also carried a good sense of humility in the midst of that, which is what I appreciate. And I think for me, that's the thing. Can we learn again what it means to be Christians and be Christians in the world, and then figure out how it is that we gather and be in community as Christians in the world. So.
And
gonna
thank you,
Mike.
Michael. Sorry, I just wanted to say, Jesse in the book says first we're Christians, right? And then we are Anglicans or Catholic or belong to the United Church. And I think that's another, for us to we're Christians. And so thank you for putting it the way you did in the book.
I'm gonna just before we turn back to you, Jesse, I'm just noting we have there was another question here about that sort of post-denominational. Is the labels of Christian denominations a problem in the way of authenticity, which I think you're both starting to address. And maybe you want to develop on that, Jesse. I also will note that I'm told that you cannot, in fact, put questions in the chat, but you can put your questions and comments in the Q&A. So please continue to do that. I believe there is a way to do that that is anonymous if you don't want to put your name to your question. So, but Jesse, do you want to say more around those questions of the institutional church, of our denominational structures?
Yeah. I mean, I was also going to go to that question about ecumenism and a post-denominational church. I didn't include it in the book, but those of us who were at the assembly, the joint Anglican and Lutheran assembly in the summer of 2023 in Calgary, heard the National Bishop Susan Johnson speak, and she was asked about the future, and she said she put her focus really on Christian presence. What does it look like to have a Christian presence in communities? Not an Anglican presence, not a Lutheran presence, but a Christian presence, because in a lot of communities, and not just rural communities, but towns and suburban areas as well, we need to work together. And I really appreciated that, and I really appreciated somebody in her position saying that. I wish she wasn't quite so close to retirement, but I really appreciated her flagging that, and that is what I'm trying to pick up on the thesis on ecumenism in here, where I look back at some of the history of 20th century ecumenism and draw on this phrase "all in each place," that all Christians in each place are called to work together, and that the way that we do that is through through recognizing the gifts we have to bring, and joining together in ministry and in mission. So that was very much on my mind. I think it's okay to mourn the passage that is taking place in the church right now, to experience grief about the loss of parts of the church that we've known. You know, grief is fine, lament is fine. Um, uh, but I also think that we're being called to take the gifts that we inherit, and transform them so that they are suited for ministry in a different in the different era that we live in. You know, and we, especially as, if we can just say, as mainline Protestant Christians in Canada, we inherit tremendous amount of gifts in terms of wealth, buildings, relationships, legal establishment, all kinds of things. They don't always feel like gifts, but they are. And our job is to transform those. We can certainly feel grief about that, and we can also feel hope about what the future looks like. And I think that you know, I don't think I say this explicitly, but certainly in my mind is the belief that one of the big challenges we have, I think, as Christians right now, and maybe as mainline Protestant Christians, I'll say, in Canada, is finding forms of Christian community that don't depend on a shared building, right? Like I would love for, I think too often when churches close or their building has to be sold, people feel like failures, and that's not right. And I would love for us to talk more directly and explicitly about how we maintain the integrity of our church communities, independent of, well, we're a community because we all deal with this white elephant of a building together. And Michael, thank you for introducing ecclesiology. I mean, I do think that ultimately is, you know, my vocation is ecclesiology, but being able to cast a vision of a church, where the life of the church is part of its witness to the world. That's what I'm going for here, and I think that witness is found in its ecumenical nature, in the quality of relationships that exist within that community, in the resistant way of life that it practices, and a whole lot of other things.
Thank you so much. So I think you're addressing to some of those questions around Christian practice. We had some comments about prayerfulness, and I want to turn to this idea of crisis. So, and there's a couple comments here. There were some comments in the in Anne and Michael's talks, and Jesse, I know you and I have had some of these conversations. So you framed the book around this polycrisis as about economics, climate, and migration. Now, both Anne specifically, you know, talked about the sort of the Taylor Swiftization of Toronto. Michael, you talked about these market forces. Jesse, you point to it as well. And I think the question I have, and maybe it's a sort of two-part question, is talk more about the crisis. What do we mean by the crisis of neoliberalism? What do we mean by these crises as principalities and powers? And I think the other question is it a polycrisis, or are these all crises, these and probably others, caused by the economic structures that we live with in the West?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just, you know, I use this word crisis, and I don't use it. We all use it, right? Mental health crisis, you know, opioid crisis, homelessness or housing crisis, racism. You know, the word crisis is all over the place. And you know, I chose to focus on three: climate, economics, and migration. Partly because this is a book, as it says, crisis-shaped world. I'm thinking globally, very specifically. So so that's where that comes from. And then when I speak about the powers in particular, I say, and I think the thesis, I'll just read the thesis here, is the economic structures of our world are the greatest obstacle to Christian witness, right? Anne mentioned part of that, our economic structures make us think that the only value that matters is the price you can put on something. That's one example. There's lots of other ones. Our economic structures are shaping our religion. We're about to enter Christmas. Well, in the church, we're about to enter Advent. In the world, we've already entered Christmas, at least in my part of the world. And I have to say, this time of year makes me brings up such difficult feelings for me. I don't like Christmas. I like going to church on Christmas morning, but the rest of it I could just do without, because I just see the way in which the powers of this world have taken over this Christian holy day and turned it into a festival of consumption. And it's really, it's a real spiritual challenge for me. And so that's the way in which a power of this world is serving as an obstacle to Christian witness. So is it, though, perhaps, Jen, another way of phrasing your question is to say it's not a polycrisis, but it's a unicrisis, really. It's just, and I use the phrase neoliberalism, like the particular model of economics that we live under right now. Well, certainly on many days I'm willing to credit that argument. On many days I'm willing to say yes, it actually is. Everything is downstream from our economic models. Everything is downstream from neoliberalism, and I can sit there in news and read story after story after story and say neoliberalism's fault, neoliberalism's fault. So don't get me started on that. I think, though, maybe what I would just say now is it's what I want us to do, what I want this book to do is help those who read it, number one, to understand the context in which we live, right? My experience is we don't talk a lot about economics in church, and we should. We should talk about the economic structures of our world and the way that they are serving as obstacles to the kingdom of God. So if this book helps with that, then I'll have succeeded. And number two, I think this ties into the point about the church and ecclesiology that I was just making, which is that the church in its style of life offers a witness, has the potential to offer a witness to the world that is resistant, that is counter to the values of this world. And if we can do that, if we can, give a foretaste of that kingdom of God, then we'll have succeeded. And that part of the way that we offer that is through our relations, economic and otherwise, with each other. And so instead of prioritizing buying and selling, instead of prioritizing acquisition, getting, we prioritize giving and receiving, relationships of gift instead of consumption. And I think that is what I'd want to hold on to. So I'm innately suspicious of any explanation that gives only one reason as the cause for everything. And yet on many days, find myself going down that path. So, that's the kind of discussion I would love for this book to start, actually. And so thank you for asking it.
Thanks. So we have too many great comments. So I'm going to talk in just a moment about the ways that you can buy this book, engage with this book. But before we do that, I want to come back to this question of Christian practice. We have a question here that, Jesse, you talk a lot in the book about how God acts in relationship to food. And you talk about gardening, you talk about cooking, you talk about preserves, you talk about eating together, you talk about the Eucharist. And it's sort of a through thread in a way on a number of these theses. So I would like to turn to Anne and to Michael, and maybe in 2 or 3 minutes each, can you comment on that? How do you think, in the work you do now, in your own ministries, in your own contexts, how does food relate to what God's doing in the world, to Christian practice, to that bold discipleship?
Well, to Jesse's,
Or does it?
Yeah, well, absolutely it does. I mean, to Jesse's point, the Eucharist brings us together, right? The Eucharist is that beautiful meal of bread and wine, you know, not even enough bread to stave away our hunger, or wine to quench our thirst. And yet it is truly food for life. But I think in so many ways, the church, through its ministry of hospitality, at the table of fellowship, meals, you know, meal sharing, the way we practice eating meals. Again, if you come back to where the world is, you know, I'm afraid for how few families actually sit together at dinner in the evening and have a meal together as a family. How few families offer a grace at the beginning of dinner. How many families just do quick drive-through on the way to some sport event. You know, this notion of how we eat and how we share what we eat with family, with friends, with communities, with those on the margins. You know, Jesus was always going from one meal to the next, sitting with people who were unloved and unlovely, and yet community formed around Jesus as he sat at those tables. I wanted just to share this thing that happened on the weekend. I went to an event, PWRDF, Primate's World Relief and Development Fund, now known as Alongside Hope. And we invited 2 farmers from Zimbabwe to be our guests at this gathering. And these 2 farmers, a man and a woman, taught us so much about living simply with what is around us. You know, Jesse, you named, you know, your community garden, where you work, you know, where you enjoy different vegetables and fruits. But what came out was how these people are healing the landscape in Zimbabwe in God's way. And I think that we can use food and fellowship and meals to begin to heal so much of these crises in very simple, beautiful ways around tables and around food.
Thanks, Anna. How about you, Michael?
I'll probably start with a story. Some years ago, I worked in a community that was fairly marginalized and poor. And one of the things we did in that community was to develop community gardens. And so our particular site was a church building, but we had land out front. And we started community gardens, and over the course of a number of years, we got the housing company to identify a number of plots where we could do community gardens. And one of the interesting things that happened about that community gardens was it became a space of connection for people across various cultural backgrounds, because people started planting their food stuff from their various community. And it was amazing the kind of intersection and relationships that came out of that, grew out of that. Subsequently, we were able to, economics again, we were able to develop a business out of those community gardens, and the fact that as folks kind of got to know each other, recognized that food was both a challenge for the community, but also food could become an opportunity for economic. You know, we developed a catering business in the community, and we got all the agencies that were doing any program to invite to use our catering service. And so, you know, what started as an opportunity for people to kind of come together and grow to grow together and build across, ended up becoming a way in which people could sustain their lives. And it's, I'm struck again, and I'm around the communion, the Eucharist, that becomes a symbol of what it means to be the community of God, in that it's around a meal, and that there's something disarming that happens. And I think that's why in Paul, there's so much, Paul pays so much attention about some of the misbehaviors and stuff that was happening around the communion table, in terms of, rather than becoming something that was open and embracing, it became something divisive. And so I think food is, and in our churches, it becomes this place where people can gather. There's a disarming, stories get told. And as we do that, we begin to recognize how important it is for us to be attentive to what's happening to Mother Earth, and to take care of that. And so I think it's both. It has a capacity to bring people together. It has a capacity to create community, and it has a capacity of being that place where we begin to understand the need to be attentive to creation as a whole. So
Thank you. So these comments, I think, are bringing us back to those questions at the heart of Christian practice, at the heart of human life, of some of those solidarity within communities with members of other communities. There's a comment here, somebody who works as a spiritual care professional in hospital, who says, working with folks from the Quebec Arctic, sometimes the most real conversations are about hunting and preserving wild food, using it for food and for medicine. So that way we can enter into those really, the realness of human life, those basic things that are really at the heart of Christian practice and belief, and that you address in the book, Jesse. We're almost at the end of our time. So I wanted to say that you can buy this book if you haven't read it yet. The official release date is December 3rd, but we have it on good authority, i.e. the author, that it is shipping now. It's available wherever fine books are sold in the United States and Canada. You can ask for it by title. You can purchase it online. You can, if you are in the United States, and I just need to pull up my screen now. If you are in the United States, in Canada as well, but this may be more interesting for American listeners, you can purchase it direct from Church Publishing if you use the code HOPE20, HOPE 20. Before December 1st, you get 20% off. 3 books gets you free shipping, so you have a copy for you and 2 copies for friends for Christmas gifts. In Canada, shipping may be prohibitive, so you might want to use that to send Christmas presents to your American friends, or organize a batch order, or however you want to do that, and look at purchasing it from a Canadian bookseller. This recording is going to be available shortly, so you can come back to it. You can share it with your friends. And if I can say, the way I engaged with this book first was in some conversation with a number of folks, some of you who may actually be here, in comments that we were scrawling in the margins. What some of those questions address some of Michael's comments about, mission from the margins. How do we hear that? How do we, in our particular positions, hear those voices from Christians, from non-Christians, from those who hold very different positions? There's a great question about that we won't be able to get to. So even before there's a study guide produced, you can do that. You can read it by yourself with friends in community, and engage in the conversation with the book and with each other. Jesse, do you have any last words to say?
Well, I do. A big word of thanks to Anne and Michael, which I've already said, for reading the book so sensitively, but Jen, also to you, which you have just mentioned, that Jen was one of the first readers of this book when it existed as a Google Doc. And some of the Lenten conversation that took place there earlier this year was really formative in making this a stronger book. So thank you, Jen, for being willing to host this, but above all, for your comments that made it stronger. I take on board the comment about the study guide. I would want to underscore, and we don't have publicity about this quite yet, but next winter, January and February, at DIO, we'll be offering an online course, a 4-week course called Christianity in a Crisis-Shaped World, which will be a chance to delve into this book. It actually won't be, you don't have to have read the book to take the course, but we'll be talking about some of the themes that lie behind this, which we've been talking about. We'll talk about some of the figures and the ideas that are behind all of that. So that'll be coming up in January and February, which will prime everybody well to do, as Anne suggested, a Lent book study on this book. And we'll maybe try to get a study guide together by then. So, but thank you so much to Anne and Michael, and to you as well, Jen.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jesse, for the gift of this book. And I think one of my reflections on this is so much of this book is about this apocalyptic clarity that brings the crisis evident. But I think there's also a real blessing in this conversation, in the theses Jesse is offering, in the reflections that you shared, in the questions that we didn't quite get to. So I would like to dismiss us with making that blessing apparent as well. So may God, who kindled the fire of love in the hearts of the saints, strengthen you like them in faith. May God, who brought all that is out of primordial chaos, encourage you as you create new possibilities. May God, who is always acting and will always act, deepen your hope for a future yet to come. And may God Almighty, the source of all being, the eternal Word, and the Holy Spirit bless you with faithfulness, with creativity, and with hope all the days of your lives. Amen.
Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Let's go. God
Thank
bless.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you
you.
all.